Hello and welcome to Contemplations. I am joined by John.
Hello.
And I am Josh. So we are going to be talking about governments controlling our behaviour, particularly one aspect, because we can't talk about everything, of course. We'll be here for several days. However, one that I find particularly interesting is nudge theory. And just to go into how it's applied in practice, nudging is a means of organisations to change your behaviour, often without your awareness, and hopefully through being able to point out what this is, what it looks like, how it's used, you can better resist it and make your own decisions. That's
So it's
my
basically,
intention.
it is literally mass manipulation. It's how to get millions of people to behave in a way you want.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really insidious. It's stuff that Goebbels would be into.
Mm-hmm. And to highlight some applications of it, using nudging allowed for 99.98% of Austrians to donate their organs, which is a ridiculously high rate of compliance. That should be a red flag. And you look at a country like Denmark, which doesn't do this, 4.25%. So there's such a large mismatch between the two there.
And they're
There's
not
something
exactly
going on.
wildly different cultures either. They're both sort of Central European, Germanic-ish. Sorry, Danes.
So yeah, of course, there are other more renowned experiments where if you put your signature at the top of a form rather than at the bottom, it makes you respond more honestly to questionnaires and things like that.
Right. Because you've already put your pledge of trust into it.
Yes.
Interesting.
So it's like a nudge to be honest. And there's also some research to show that people are more inclined to donate money when triggered to think about something religious. So if they nudge you, just like, what would God think about you keeping all that money to yourself, that sort of thing, then people are more likely to
So
donate to charities.
a lot of this reminds me of the psychological studies on priming, where we know that priming is a real phenomenon, but a lot of the specific claims when they're exposed to actual like rigorous research, large sample sizes and so on, they turn out to be a lot less reliable than you at first
I've
think.
actually done my own research on priming.
Okay.
I had a sample of about 150 people, which isn't anything to necessarily turn your nose up at. And
So what I mean, worthless research, tiny sample size. Sorry, carry on.
and I found that it didn't work.
Really?
Yes.
Interesting.
Which goes along with a lot of other research, actually, that suggests that it either has such a negligible role that it's basically easy to ignore, or it just simply doesn't work.
Yeah, I think a lot of this sort of thing is suspicious and it's narrative building because these stylized facts, like putting one's signature at the top of the form makes someone respond more honestly, that might be true. It sounds plausible. There is a narrative built into that you can readily get behind and just say, oh yes, and a scientist said it, so it must be true. But actually, I would be doubtful. Unless, without seeing proper verification studies, you can't actually bet the farm on that.
Well, yes, obviously, with a lot of the findings that we talk about, these are of single studies, and more often than not, they're not, at least in this context of this episode, we're probably not going to be too supportive of their agenda behind them.
But having said that, on the other hand, the 99.98% donation rate in Austria compared to 4.25 in Denmark, like that's a massive sample size. That's reliable. That's something actually happening and affecting the real world, so you can rely on that.
Yeah, but we can certainly say that nudge theory is something that exists, and there's enough evidence to suggest that it works, which is why I'm concerned about it in the first place. Is that
if it didn't work, we wouldn't care about it.
Yes,
it does work.
I mean, it's not like I've spoke about diversity training and unconscious bias training. I think it was with Callum where we talked about how there's a backfire effect, and this training actually makes racial stereotypes more salient and in the mind than they would otherwise, and therefore actually
makes you more racist.
Yes. So
that's amazing.
That's something like you're resisting some kind of training that you're doing.
No wonder critical race theorists are so fond of it.
Yeah, I know.
You more racist.
But there's also the effect here that you're not even aware of this happening sometimes, whereas you're very aware of this kind of woke training, and most people kind of grin and bear it. I don't think anyone's happy to be called racist.
Well, I think the effectiveness of nudge theory is the realization that whenever you push a narrative, right, you're going to get maybe 80% of people follow it, just blindly conform if it's a good narrative. But then you'll get 18%, say, who will just blindly oppose it simply because they resent you trying to push this narrative. And then you will get maybe 2% of the population who I like to think of myself as a more thinking contrarian, that I will generally oppose such things, but I won't do so blindly. I'll do so through research. And I think what the real power of nudge theory is that 18% of people who would blindly oppose it, they don't get triggered, so to speak. They aren't even aware that there's something to impose, that there's something that's being forced on them. And so they are likely to join the other 80% and raise your compliance rate from 80% to 98%.
Yeah.
Just obviously those are illustrative numbers and based on absolutely no research whatsoever. But that's the
I get the point you're trying to make, yeah. So how does this actually fit in with the kind of government's repertoire? Obviously, governments are, their survival is contingent on support by a variable minority of people. It's not a majority. That's very, very rare. And most of the time, this minority of people is kind of undefinable. You just go beyond a tipping point and then no longer the government can survive, right? So this is a case, whatever political system you have, be it a democracy or a dictatorship, they still need support from a percentage of the population. You can't just be a man in the room, in a room with his finger on the nuclear button and everyone hates you.
Right. It's not like if you got rid of Adolf Hitler, then that would just be the end of the Second World War. It's not like if you got rid of Putin, that would be the end of Russian expansionism. Even Putin has his base of Russian nationalists that he needs as his, as you say, variable minority to stay in power.
Yeah, so obviously in a democracy we use rhetoric to suggest that we have popular support, but that doesn't happen. So unless you're like the Australians where you're actually forced to vote, most of the voter turnouts are significantly less than the whole population. So in the UK, you've got, in 2019, I think it was 67.3% of the turnout, which a further 43.6% voted for the governing party.
Yes,
so that's a very small, in terms of if you want actual popular support, that's going pretty far short of it, isn't it? And then in 2005, only 35% voted for the ruling party in the UK. And then in the US in 2016, only 54.8% actually turned out of voters.
But I must say, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that turnout is low.
No, but
I think there's an implicit value judgment we make on that turnout should be very high. But actually, I think in some ways it's better if lots of people, for whatever reason, don't have to care about politics or feel they don't.
Yeah.
They can get on with their own lives, supporting the economy, etc., etc.
I actually support less and less people voting because it gives my vote more weight. So, yes.
It's a selfish argument.
I don't care. When it comes to politics, you've got to be a bit selfish because no one else is looking out for you, are they? I mean, other than the people who agree with you, in which case you can form a voting bloc. But never mind, that's all a bit of a tangent. So out of the necessity to win support, governments try and control what people think to try and foster this support base, more or less. And they either do this through direct propaganda from themselves, which is pretty easy to identify, or more effectively, I think, through their friends in the media, business and unions, where it seems like it's a bit more organic, doesn't it? But of course, all of this stuff happens with people who are at least connected to the people who want to seek re-election or election or what have you.
Yeah, the greatest asset of the BBC is the illusion that it's not the British state-connected or state-funded. The illusion of impartiality and neutrality.
Well, yes, they're the ones that pay their bills, though, aren't they? They're the ones that dictate their funding. So that's pretty powerful. I think I'm pretty sure the money talks.
It does.
Although that being said, they've got a conservative government and a very left-leaning state media.
A very left-leaning civil service.
That's
How
true,
interesting.
Yeah. So, of course, nudge theory gives us a more novel way to control human behaviour. You don't necessarily have to directly create these expensive propaganda campaigns. You can just create initiatives quite often that you would have created already, but do it in a slightly different way, which shapes how people behave, how they think, and perhaps make them more favourable to you.
Yeah.
And this obviously isn't exactly in the spirit of democracy, if that matters to you, because of course you're coercing people in a albeit soft kind of way to vote for you, and it's not necessarily authentic. It can also be somewhat innocuous, like trying to encourage people to eat more fruit and veg.
No, that's evil. Sorry, carry on.
No, but eating more healthily and encouraging people to do that is certainly far less malevolent than trying to get them to vote
I
for
know.
you.
But what they tend to do in actual fact is encourage people to eat less meat rather than eat more fruit.
Yes, I know.
I
disagree
get
with
your
that.
fruit and veg, get Lotus Eaters support you getting a healthy diet and your 5 a day and so on.
But of course, there is still some sort of malevolence around there, because if they're encouraging you to live healthily, it's not that they necessarily genuinely care. Maybe some people do, of course, but there is also the idea that people who are successful and happy and have lots of aspects of their life sorted are more likely to justify the system that they find themselves in, because they've found success, they've found happiness, and therefore, well, if it's worked for me, it must work, that sort of thing. So if you get people on the side, even if it's not necessarily politically, you get them living a good life, then they're more likely to be in favour of the status quo. Yes.
That's true, but it's also insidious from a moral angle, which is that it presumes that those doing the nudging know what is best.
Exactly.
Which I'm sure we'll get into later.
That is something we're going to look at in great detail. So we're going to look at nudge theory because, of course, this is being used now. And proponents of nudge theory argue that because of the human susceptibility to an array of cognitive biases, we often make suboptimal choices and decisions that make us poorer, less healthy, and more miserable than we otherwise might be. And we are, of course, susceptible to these cognitive biases, and we'll have a look at a few of them because I've studied them in great detail, actually, and we can have a look at what we can actually do about them and whether nudge theory is really the answer. And I would suggest that perhaps it isn't, although people may have noble aims in encouraging people to eat more healthily. I think that the ethics of it, and also the kind of questionable amount of license we give to authority to do that to us is just too much.
Yeah.
So moving on to the actual book that kind of popularized the theory, is Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth and Happiness. I'm just going to read the summary about this book. I think it came out in 2008. However, the actual nudge theory has been around since, I think, the late 80s, early 90s, as far as I'm aware from the research I've read.
Right.
But nevertheless, this is the book that popularized it. And I believe it is written by Thaler and Sunstein. And Thaler in particular is important because he's one of the big names in behavioural economics, along with Kahneman and Tversky.
Right. Yeah.
That's kind of the big three, if you will. And I've read a fair amount of his work, actually, and quite often it's very good. And I think just because he's come up with this, I don't want you to necessarily tar him with the same brush, because he's just like, yes.
Josh is a fanboy.
Yeah, he's done good work.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing you have to remember with scientists. It's very tempting to paint people as good or bad, my side, not my side. But what a lot of the top scientists tend to do is they just produce so much research that even if some of it goes really bad, and that's what they're known for, that doesn't mean everything they've ever done is tainted. Yes.
There's also the fact that he's very insistent on it being used in a good nature, and talks a lot about the potential dangers of it, and actually did a fair amount to outline, okay, well, this would be really
Crossing
bad.
the line.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, good
so he described the theory.
I bet our bureaucrats skipped that chapter. It's like, ethics, ain't got time for
this
that.
is actually something that happens a lot, where scientists publish research theory, government applies it in a horrible totalitarian way, and then everyone blames the scientists.
Right, I know, it's not fair, is it?
No, but there we go. That's my agenda out of the way.
Good.
So I'll read the description that they give of the book anyway. Every day we make choices about what to buy or eat, about financial investments or our children's health and education, even about the causes we champion or the planet itself. Unfortunately, we often choose poorly. Nudge is about how we make these choices and how we can make better ones. Using dozens of eye-opening examples and drawing on decades of behavioural science research, Nobel Prize winner Richard H. Thaler and Harvard Law School professor Kassar Sunstein show that no choice is ever presented to us in a neutral way, and that we are all susceptible to biases that can lead us to make bad decisions. But by knowing how people think, we can use sensible choice architecture to nudge people towards the best decision for ourselves, our families, and our society without restricting our freedom of choice. And they are very insistent about that last part, that it's only really a nudge if you are free to make a decision counter to the nudge. If you can't make that decision, then it's coercion.
Yeah. When it's like, oh, he didn't do what we told him to, what we asked him to, so we had to force him to.
Yeah,
That is just, and that's what the government has done a lot during coronavirus as well. Then that's downright evil. It's not nudge, it's coercion. You're quite
and
right.
this is why I've got it in the thumbnail that this is a soft form of authoritarianism, because it's not full authoritarianism and just we're going to force you to do something. But they're just like, yeah, we're going to just give you a nudge and, you're going to be more inclined to do what we tell you, but we're not really telling you what to do.
But the really insidious thing about it is they give everyone a nudge. And so, okay, you've got this 18% of people we said earlier who aren't going to agree. Well, let's say the nudge means that half of them, they conform instead of being contrary. Well, that means you've reduced the number of dissidents, the number of people you have to coerce, by half. So that's where it gets really insidious, because they don't really care, even if you're able to spot the nudge and get past it. If they've already neutralized everyone else who would otherwise stand with you, then it means they can come down on you like a ton of bricks and no one will care.
Yes, and there are certainly many examples of that, and I'm pretty sure that this first half is the part that's going up on YouTube, so we can't talk about that until the latter half. But don't worry, we will touch on that. So, as I mentioned before, I've read a fair few research papers by Thaler in particular, and he's done a very good job of outlining lots of behavioural decision-making trends that have then been subsequently replicated by a whole host of other people, and he's relatively highly esteemed. So I don't want you to think that the science behind it is wrong. I'm not trying to convince you of this. I'm actually against nudge theory, so I don't really have much of an agenda to be pressing here. So my own research has also been predicated on some of his findings. So I feel like I am somewhat qualified to talk about it, I suppose.
Awesome.
So Thaler and Sunstein defined the concept of nudge theory as follows, and they provided a nice, concise definition, which is a bit different from the nice flowery version that they gave in describing their book. So a nudge, as well as we will use the term, is any aspect of choice architecture that will alter people's behaviour in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. To count as a mere nudge, the intervention must be easy and cheap to avoid. Nudges are not mandates. Putting fruit at eye level counts as a nudge. Banning junk food does not.
Nudges are not mandates.
Well, technically correct, but it's debatable, isn't it?
But this is Thaler, isn't it? This is his work. So in his point of view, if you follow up the nudge with a mandate, then you're not nudging, you're using brute state coercion, reading between the lines from what you've told me.
And I think Thaler has described it as libertarian paternalism is the term he used, which seems very juxtaposition.
I presume we're going to talk about that aspect of it later on.
Yeah, we can talk about it now if you want.
So it seems to me that if you're calling yourself a libertarian because the idea is instead of forcing people to do what you want, you manipulate them into doing what you want, I don't think you're actually a libertarian.
I agree, yeah, that's funny.
And I've seen a wealth of literature describing people using nudge theory in policy as libertarian, or going for libertarian interventions. The prime example being David Cameron, of all people, who was described for making extensive use of behavioural science in policymaking as more libertarian. And the reason I really don't like this is because I think libertarian philosophy is founded on an idea that you kind of let people do what they want, because the assumption is that if you do, then you'll get better outcomes.
Yes.
And if you're saying, well, we need to nudge people in the right direction, what you're doing is you're betraying that assumption by saying that, no, if we let people do what they want, they won't do what we want them to do. And what we want them to do with their lives is far more important with what they want to do with their lives. And that's not libertarian at all. It's the antithesis of it. And that's why it is paternalism.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.